bad. Well, that's bullshit, to be blunt.
As the Canadian Conservative leadership race heats up, well, some of the leaders of the most powerful institutions in Canada are getting a little bit upset. So let's skip the intro and get into exactly what is pissing them off so much. This all started after some comments from the front runner in the race to be the leader of the Conservative Party and to take on Trudeau in the next federal election, Pierre Poilievre.
Among those polled by Ipsos who said they'll vote Conservative in the next election, 32% said they want Poilievre to be leader. Just 14% picked former Quebec Premier Jean Charest.
And the group that Poilievre has riled up, well, it's central bankers, more specifically people at the Bank of Canada, actually former heads of the entire Bank of Canada. Let me show you what Poilievre tweeted here that got them so upset. He said, the Bank of Canada says Bitcoiners lack financial literacy. This is from the same people who promised we'd have deflation right before inflation hit a 30-year high. And then this is the main comment that really got them riled up. It is our central bank that is financially illiterate. And this came from a research paper from the Bank of Canada saying Bitcoin investors tend to have low levels of financial literacy, according to this new Bank of Canada research. But now, as we like to do on the channel, we're going to go a little bit deeper and see exactly what this is saying. This comes from a research report that was published on April 19th called Bitcoin Awareness, Ownership, and Use 2016-20. The point that Poilievre took issue with is right here. Bitcoin owners displayed greater knowledge about the Bitcoin network than non-owners, yet they scored lower on questions testing financial literacy. And this is what the fiery exchange between Poilievre and the central bankers is all about. They actually exchange back and forth, and we're going to cover that in just a moment. And Pierre is not entirely happy about this, neither is the Bank of Canada. But when I saw that they were tracking things based on financial literacy, it makes you wonder, okay, what are they using to actually measure someone's financial literacy? Well, if you look closer here at the Bank of Canada paper, you can see that the financial literacy scores are calculated based on the responses to the 3 financial literacy questions, according to Lissardi and Mitchell 2014. So this is another research paper that it's citing. So I did a little bit more digging and actually found what the criteria for financial literacy is, and let me show you what I found. They base it off of 3 questions. Now, the 3 questions that they ask people to grade their financial literacy, the first one is, suppose you had $100 in savings account and the interest rate was 2% per year. After 5 years, how much do you think you would have in the account? More than 102, which is the correct answer. Exactly 102 or less than 102. And then the second question here is, imagine the interest rate on your savings account was 1% per year and inflation was 2% per year, and after 1 year you'd be able to buy. Would you be able to buy less than today or more than today or about the same? And then the third question here, which is the most interesting one, is, do you think that the following statement is true or false? Buying a single company's stock usually provides a safer return than a stock mutual fund. Again, this is sort of testing for someone's knowledge of what even is a mutual fund and how does that work. Obviously, something that I sort of preach on the channel is investing in index ETFs, less fees than mutual funds, but that's beside the point. So based on this data that the Bank of Canada has selected, they're saying people who hold Bitcoin have lower financial literacy. Okay, and now Poilievre takes issue with that and says, well, the bank is the one that's financially illiterate. It's not the citizens who are holding Bitcoin. It's the Bank of Canada itself. And this is what pissed off specifically the former Bank of Canada governor, David Dodge. Now, whenever we hear from the governors of the Bank of Canada who are currently in session, we don't get a lot of information. They just sort of say the least information as possible so that they don't get in trouble in the press. But when someone retires, like we've seen Stephen Poloz or David Dodge, well, they start to actually give the central bank's true opinion, because this is what they sort of are able to say now, that they're not actually holding that position.
Bank is financially illiterate. It's been so bad. Well, that's bullshit, to be blunt. That's blunt. Really? Yeah, absolutely. The bank understands. You're insulted by that. Yes, I'm very insulted by that. And why? 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 Because they understand what's going on. They made a judgment call, right, which I think was 100% right. Right. And would have been claimed by people like Poilievre to be absolutely crazy in the spring of 21, in the spring of 20. But it was that judgment call in the spring of 20 that saved us from a real depression coming out of the Right.
pandemic.
Interesting.
So obviously David Dodge is pretty pissed off here, saying that Pierre's comments are bullshit. And he starts sort of going on about making a judgment call, a call that the Bank of Canada made at the beginning of the pandemic. Now, this was a call that upset Pierre Poilievre quite a lot. Now, at the beginning of the pandemic, the Bank of Canada, to stimulate the economy, began printing billions and billions of dollars every single week through something called their quantitative easing program. Now, by doing this, they've stimulated the economy and produced more demand for goods so that people will go out and continue to spend. Now, this worked at the beginning of the pandemic when we sort of saw less consumer demand, everyone staying inside, but Pierre Poilievre now believes that that's the reason we're seeing inflation now, is that we've added all this new money to the system, that increases the amount of demand in the system, and we have less supply, so that's why we're getting the higher cost of living, higher real estate prices. But David Dodge here is saying, well, while that might be the case, we think it was a good idea to do this money printing, this stimulus, to stimulate the economy. Otherwise, we might have even had deflation, which can be even more damaging for the economy.
Again, Mr. Poilievre says that we've got to take back our money. He tells Canada we've got to take back our money supply, and we've got to also, he's talking about crypto being able to opt out of inflation. What do you make about take back our money supply and opting out of inflation?
Well, I have no idea what he's talking about, and neither does he in that regard. On the crypto issue, he's just wrong. He's just wrong because the issue of rising prices rising prices that you have to cope with out of your income is fundamentally at the moment a structural one. That we have limitations on supply.
Now, the second half of the clip is where things get a little bit spicy. Dodge essentially saying, Pierre, you're an idiot. You don't know what you're talking about. I don't know what you're talking about, so you probably don't know what you're talking about either, and makes the clear statement that no, you can't opt out of inflation with crypto like Bitcoin or Ether. You can't do that because all of these issues, these inflation issues are as a result of the structural issues that we have with not enough supply, these supply chain issues, something that central bankers have been saying for the past year. And I agree that there are parts of inflation that you can't opt out of. Of course, if we don't have enough supply of something, we're going to see increased prices there. But it completely ignores what I believe is the main sort of point here when they're saying you can opt out of inflation with crypto. What I believe they're saying here is you can opt out of a system that is centrally controlled by some actors that aren't actually elected by the people that they're representing, i.e. the central bank, right? Right now, they chose to print all this money, add all this money to the system, and they made that decision in a very centralized way. I remember I didn't have any say in that, you didn't have any say in that, and it's also independent from the Canadian government, or it's supposed to be, right? So they didn't have any say in the Bank of Canada's actions in that instance. So what I think is being said here is like, yes, we're going to have sort of supply up and down, it's going to affect the prices of things, but if you don't want to have individuals tinkering with your monetary system and potentially having portions of that inflation show up, that higher cost of living show up as a result of the actions of those few actors, well then maybe you can opt out of the current system that you're in and partake in a different one where the rules are far more transparent and actually are written in code as to what happens in terms of inflation. And in and of itself, a lot of crypto and digital assets are inflationary as well. You can see right now the current Bitcoin inflation rate is 1.8% per year. Now, of course, this sort of steps down over time with halvenings. That's one thing that Bitcoiners like to talk about a lot. But even Ether and the Ethereum network, well, that is also inflationary right now with a 2.9% growth per year. And this can sort of fluctuate based on different aspects of network demand and transaction volume. But the difference here is that amount of inflation, that amount of new printing of money into the system, well, that's controlled programmatically and is very clear and transparent. We can see how that's going to happen over time. Whereas with the current fiat system, well, we don't have that control and central bankers can just choose to do what they want to do with it, which is something that more and more people are getting less comfortable with. But before I get down that rabbit hole, obviously Pierre didn't like what Dodge said, essentially calling him an idiot and saying that he doesn't know what he's talking about. So Pierre, in turn, replied on Twitter and the drama continues. Take a look at this. He tweets, more proof we need to take control of money from politicians and bankers and give it to the people. He says former central banker Dodge should be embarrassed today. He said nothing as the Bank of Canada became Trudeau's ATM. We'll talk about that in a second. Inflating real estate by 50% and consumer prices to 30-year highs. While all these so-called experts said Canada would have deflation, I correctly predicted 2 years ago that Trudeau's money printing deficits would cause inflation. Well, we'll talk about that as well in a moment. And David Dodge says he's offended, and Pierre says good. You know who also is offended? The single mom who can't afford food, the worker who can't afford to fill his gas tank, and the 32-year-old living in his mom's basement because the government inflated the cost of living to generational highs. The establishment doesn't want to be held accountable for the misery they caused our working class. Too bad. Get used to it. I'm just getting started. And some strong words from Poilievre. Now, I think this criticism is fair, but there are some sort of points in here that are under debate, right? Like he's saying that the Bank of Canada was Trudeau's ATM. At the beginning of the pandemic, the government had to spend a whole bunch more money. At the same time that the Bank of Canada kind of gave a lot of money to the Government of Canada through its purchase of Government of Canada bonds. However, both of these sort of individual participants may have chosen to do these things independently, and it looks very coincidentally like the Government of Canada was getting funded by the Bank of Canada, but some people think that they're sort of in cahoots to make this happen. So that's sort of two sides on that issue here. And they also talk about how they predicted deflation and how Pierre predicted inflation, which we're seeing now. Now, we certainly would have seen deflation if there was no money printing that happened at all at the beginning of the pandemic. There's far less demand, people spending far less money out in the economy, and that's one of the reasons that the Bank of Canada started printing so much money. We would have seen deflation if there wasn't any printing, but also as a result of that money printing and that stimulating of the economy, well, now we're sort of dealing with the repercussions, the high inflation, high cost of living, and that's sort of in tandem with the supply chain issues that are making the cost of living even more challenging. Now, since some of these statements from Poilievre, well, the people on Twitter have kind of been clowning him. Let me show you this take from Trevor Tome. It says, Bitcoin prices since March 15th, you can see the clear decline in the chart here, down 25%, and marking this moment rather high, not comparatively to where it has been, but it says Pierre Poilievre says opt out of inflation by buying crypto, and we see the chart just going down. But I think that this kind of misses the point. Yes, digital assets, Bitcoin, Ethereum, these things are very volatile. Prices will go up and down. I personally believe that they will go up over time as more and more people adopt the technology. But this kind of misses the point, right? We're not saying that you can opt out of volatility. What we're saying is you can opt out of a system which its inflation can be controlled by central actors, right? We talked about this before. I don't think it's opting out of inflation in general. Of course, you're going to have supply side changes and demand side changes, and that's going to change the price of goods, of course. But what we're saying here is you can opt out of a system where inflation is controlled by a set group of people and instead opt into a system that's transparent where everyone plays by the same rules. Now, whether or not Pierre articulates it in that way, it remains to be seen. I think that he could sort of do a better job of explaining it in those terms, but that's certainly the way that I see things here. And I'm sure things will heat up even more as we get closer and closer to the sort of conservative election day to elect the next leader of the Conservative Party. Even more so if we get to an election where Pierre sort of takes on Trudeau here. It's going to be fun to watch and certainly a lot of more fire if this is any indication of what's to come. But I just wanted to bring this information to you and sort of cover this because it's not every day you hear a former Bank of Canada governor go on the news and say, well, this politician is just spewing bullshit. So let me know what you think of this all down in the comments. I read every single one, try to reply to as many as I possibly can. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. And with all that said, I hope this video has helped you out at least a little bit, and I'll see you next time.